embarrassing. You'll be okay with it. The reason I show my sketchbook, I've drawn all my life. And I went to school for graphic design and things like that, but I've just drawn all the time. I was looking for something I could get paid to draw, basically. I was not a good enough illustrator at that time to know I could make a living doing it, so I did graphic design. So, but I started these when I was right where you guys were. So when I was a sophomore and junior in college, I started keeping these. So I've got 24 of these. I film about one a year. So, and this is how I do any of this. So brainstorming for graphic design projects, there's probably one for every two of you. So if you guys don't mind sharing, let's see if I have to go around. So I might have to take that one back. There's a couple reasons I show these, and this is tied to me being an illustrator, and also tied. So, here's the reasons why I like to show these sketchbooks. First of all, I just started drawing all my life. Okay, I only had a few drawing classes. So the first things that you will notice, or that I will say about what's in here, is a lot of this is crap. Okay, I am not a fine artist. I don't draw things realistically. This is just my mind working and chewing on stuff. Okay? For whatever reason, I work mostly in ink, and I just do stuff. So I like to show it to students so that you do a few things. One is you're not afraid to sketch and just draw stuff. Because when I ask students to sketch for a project, they get, I don't draw well. It doesn't have to look like anything particular. It doesn't have to be shaded. It just needs to communicate. So the more that you can let go of that kind of anxiety or insecurity about how your sketches look, the better you can develop an idea and just run around with it. So that's what these are full of. It's just kind of running around with stuff. And some of them fall down, and some of them run into other ideas I have going on. And so they're part journal, and there's stuff that has my kids, scribbles all over it, and stuff that I have that I'm writing or designing or sketching or whatnot. So it's just really my playground. So this is how I develop an idea. The illustration part of me is just something, like I said, I've always done. So while my sketchbooks and drawing is integral to me as a designer, this is kind of what comes out of some of these. So basically, the sketches become, I'll hand a couple of these around to you, become these sorts of things, which are, I take them out of my sketchbook, I scan them in. There's not, I don't know what to call them. I call them nonsense. They're just a bunch of made up stuff, okay? But for me, if I draw something, I'm never going to draw it again. If you guys ever drawn something, then you trace it or use carbon paper and transfer it to watercolor paper, so then you can watercolor it, or any, yes, no?
Yes.
Okay, if I've drawn it once, I am never drawing it again. Every thing I try to do with it just makes me miserable. It's very frustrating. If I trace it, it loses all its life. It becomes very flat and loses its expression. Very frustrating, okay? So, my solution has been to take the sketch, make it as messy and whatever as possible in my sketchbook, and then I scan it in. And then I go from there. Okay? That's the device that works for me. That's so I'll do it here where I can work very freely and I don't have to care, and things happen very easily for me. And then I take it into digital where I have more control over color, things like that. Let's see what I was going to say. There's things I don't like about that. If you look at these, some of them are watercolor. I'm not a very good watercolorist. it's very stressful for me because it goes to mud so easily. So that's why, again, I started using flat colors. You see a lot of them. It's just like taking the Photoshop. I'm going to show you what I do in case that's a way for you to work. Okay? It's very straightforward. It's kind of like coloring book stuff. What I miss is the texture of watercolor. Watercolor is a wonderful texture and wonderful variation, and I kind of miss that. But that means me training myself more in watercolor, which I haven't given myself the time or the focus to do. So I work my little runarounds. So there's a snowman one. Is this a snowman one? Mm-hmm. Can I hold this up a second? So this snowman one has a really pretty awful wash on it. If any of you, is anyone taking water media? Has anyone done that? Okay, you have to control your space pretty well, and I'm pretty impatient, so I'm not good with that. To work around that, what I've done is I've actually done a decent wash once, and I scanned it in, and then I recolor it, whatever layout I need to use. So I've used the same watercolor wash sometimes a whole bunch of times, which is kind of lame, but again, it's kind of what works for me. I'm not that good at color. I really need to work at color. I need to adjust it. That's what I hate about watercolor, is if I spend the time doing the drawing I like, and then I put watercolor on it, and it doesn't work out, not only is the watercolor done, the sketch is done. Now I lost the sketch I was really happy with, because I've drawn it on the watercolor paper. So here's another hoop I've jumped through, is I've done, anyone use Krill pens or the dip pens? I've done that with sepia ink, and I've drawn in my sketchbook something. Then I scan that in, and then because I was very happy with that, well, I scanned it in, and then I printed it out onto watercolor paper. Then I spray fixed it. Then I watercolored on that. So if I screwed it up, I still had my drawing that I could go back and print out again. So this sounds way more complicated than it needs to be, but my brother and other people I know who can just draw it again, that just doesn't work for me. Once I've drawn it, it's never going to work that way again. So I've got that's my handicap, so this is my solution. So, but I heartily encourage you to think of that back and forth with our media, okay? Students in my illustration class can draw way better than I can. They draw their own way, I draw my own way. But also, don't think everything has to happen in the computer. Have you guys worked with Illustrator, right? Illustrator, if you draw with Illustrator, even with a Wacom, it's going to feel very digital. It's going to have these nice, clean, smooth edges. Then there's brushes, but they feel like brushes. Okay. One thing I like a lot about my ink in here is that it soaks into the page in funky ways. So I like to enlarge that and have that irregularity. I don't like it when it gets too clean. And sometimes I have to draw something and it has to be clean, and that works. But I'm drawn more to the kind of the rough edge, less refined thing. So that's kind of my introduction to how I kind of do my things. I have some examples to show you, but then anyone have any questions or comments? So I would encourage you to do this too. This is incredibly eye-opening, is to keep your stuff. I started these sketchbooks because I hated the spiral-bound ones, where after a year all the pages are falling out. I worked on trace for a while. Everyone work on rolls of trace paper? There's something wonderful about just rolling the page and just going, and it seems indefinite, but you can't scan it, you can't store it. It's awful, annoying, wrinkly stuff. And it's hard to present in a presentable manner. So these are they hold up until the binding starts to break down. But it's very educational. Whenever I finish a sketchbook, I usually go grab some of my early ones and leaf through them. And it's really humbling and interesting to see where you were in your life at this time, what was going on, and how much better you may have gotten than where you were, where you are now. So, and it's a discipline. I know a guy I was in architecture school in undergrad, and there were some architecture students who their sketchbook was a work of art. Each page was this glorious, unbelievable, fine art painting, and that was intimidating. It's like I can't do that. I would never start. So instead, there's this mess of whatever it is. So, and I've grown accustomed to that. So the other thing in terms of design or illustration, the other thing I would encourage you guys to keep in mind is that what I think we're all here for more than anything else is to gradually get confidence and hold on to, well, this is how I do things. And that's what's going to make you distinctive. And ideally, that's eventually what's going to make people want you to do a project versus somebody else. Sure, everybody knows all the software, that's a given. Your portfolio's, very neat and clean, and you've got great work in it, that's all a given. But the way you do your work, and that, your character showing up in it, ends up being what's important. And the other things I tell in my intro classes too, especially, is that remember, all the work you do is a summation of what you've already experienced. It's not like what you've done already in your life doesn't matter. All that stuff is actually what makes your work interesting and distinctive and different. The places you've been, the movies you've seen, the books you like, the games you play, all that stuff is going to steer your stuff in its own funky, interesting, different direction. So, all right. So now, Randy said I'm a professional illustrator. You can take that with a grain of salt because getting paid anything to illustrate has been. We could probably do one, right?
Yes, please. Yes.
Do that other one. Try that.
Yes.
This is fewer lights, but it's right
Yeah,
on the screen.
let's do that. That'll be all right.
You need to keep the light so that he can see me.
Right.
I'm already
Yep.
dark skinned.
I was trying to see which one.
Okay. So, let's see. So these prints I handed around are things I just started doing, and I sell them. I go to Inman Park Festival and stuff like that. It was very exciting for me to actually have clients who said, we'd like you to do an illustration for us. We have a budget. Usually we don't have a budget, but would you do this book cover? Which I stopped doing because it's just didn't work. I'm not a great business person to begin with, and it didn't help matters to not get paid for any of this time. So a couple things. First, I'll start off and I'll show you some examples of how I actually do an illustration, both in terms of let's see, is that right? Photoshop. Let me find Photoshop. So I'll show you a process I went through, and this is just one of those illustrations. There's a Noah's Ark one. I don't know where it went. It's floating around somewhere. And my own kind of take on those things is just that something occurs to me to draw, and I'll draw it, and it's like, okay, so how am I going to make this little twist in it that's actually interesting to me? I started drawing and doing all these illustrations this way when my kids were born, and I was working at Turner for Turner Sports Interactive. And we knew all along when my kids were born, I would be the one staying home because I had the job with no benefits. So I went and I spent time with my son and my daughter for the next 6 years. So that's when that stuff started happening, which was fantastic and very exciting, and nothing I would have anticipated happening. So this is a kind of a wonderful blending of just thinking differently and seeing differently, seeing the world a little differently. All right, let me start with these. So first I'm going to start with just some process stuff, okay? From my sketchbooks, and the other reason I show my students is I'm a process guy. I want you to try a whole bunch of different stuff. If you're in one of my classes, I'm going to want you to sketch and sketch and sketch and sketch and try a bunch of different things. Because I can't pretend to know what something will be like unless you're actually trying to see what happens. Okay? So this is my start. I knew I wanted some, that's not relevant, but in there you know that's what happens. Stuff just kind of bangs against each other. So I want to do this Noah thing, and this is probably later on than it looks like, but anyways, I wanted everything crammed together in this little tiny boat. And that's kind of, I guess, my starting point. But I didn't like that angle. So I wanted all this stuff in here and then trying to figure out scale and position that became more interesting. So there's one.